Good evening, everyone, and we return to our series. And I thought that for this class, what we do, because we spent a lot of time just kind of sinking into the whole Watcher story and the way it developed. And I want to take a step back today and kind of remind you guys what we're talking about, where we are in our larger topic, which is biblical interpretation in the Second Temple period, and where these things fit in there and what we're going to be discussing next. Okay, I am going to use examples that you've seen before, but because they're such classic examples, just as kind of textual anchors. Okay, so what have we been seeing when we looked at the book of Enoch, we looked at the book of Jubilees, and then we went into Dead Sea Scrolls. So when we talk about these as works of the Second Temple period, Enoch, Jubilees more than Enoch are classified as rewritten Bible. Enoch maybe a little bit less so. Why? Because Enoch is taking one little piece and using it as a springboard for whole new stories going around Enoch. So even though it's anchored, it has an anchor in the biblical text, there's a lot of it that's really kind of new and completely outside and doesn't necessarily come back to the biblical text. All of a sudden you're in a completely different story and a completely different treatise of Enoch. And what that it's very much an example, the book of Enoch, of real pseudepigrapha, a book that really is characterized by the fact that it is connected to a specific biblical character, right? So the idea that this is about Enoch, we know certain things about Enoch from the biblical text, not a lot, but that's what everything is kind of growing out of. And then he becomes characterized more as his story is added to, and as there are more and more works that are written around Enoch. The book of Jubilees, right, is a classic example of rewritten Bible where it's retelling a biblical story, right? So I'm going to pull up some of the examples. We've discussed them before, but just so we have kind of an anchor to remind us, and I'm not just speaking in the air. So here are some examples that we have seen before. Let me just actually share my whole screen, I think. Yes. Okay. So here I'm going to skip forward to Jubilees, right? We talked about this, where Jubilees is retelling the story. And we are going to come back to Jubilees later. I do want to take a little bit of a break from strict rewritten Bible, but we're going to come back to Jubilees when we talk more about rewritten Bible. But here we have an example where it's saying to Moshe in the whole, then you return to, so again, actually, you know what, why don't let me see if let me pull up, I hadn't planned on doing this, but let me pull up the beginning of Jubilees, because it will actually, I think, be a little bit more illustrative for this. Give me one moment. So because I keep on saying what Jubilees is supposed to be, and not looking at the introduction. So we'll come back to this when we look at Jubilees more in depth, but this is what I'm talking about. I'm going to share my screen here. This is Vanderkam's translation. It's an excellent translation. I really can't praise it enough. It's very, very very literal. It's actually it's not necessarily always literal. It will use like mind instead of heart when it's translating the word for heart. But it's always very, word to word. In other words, Vanderkam is very consistent in his translation, and it's an excellent translation. Let me I want to, there we go. Okay. All right, so this is the prologue of the book of Jubilees. These are the words regarding the divisions of the times of the law and of the testimony of the events of the years, of the weeks of their jubilees throughout all the years of eternity, as he related them to Moses on Mount Sinai, when he went up to receive the stone tablets, the law and the commandments on the Lord's orders, as he had told him that he should come up to the summit of the mountain. Wordy, as is typical for Second Temple literature. But what it's saying is, these are the words that Moshe got on Mount Sinai, besides when he went up to receive the laws and the commandments, he got these. It says, during the first year of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt, in the third month, the Lord said to Moshe, come up to me on the mountain. I will give you the 2 stone tablets. Okay, so he goes up, right? And when he summoned Moshe into the cloud on the seventh day, he saw the glory of the Lord. He stays there 40 days and 40 nights. And then he says, now you write this entire message, which I am telling you today. I'm skipping to chapter 1, verse 7. Now you write this entire message, which I'm telling you today, because I know their defiance and their stubbornness, even before I bring them into the land, which I promised by oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. To your posterity, I will give you the land which flows with milk and honey, when they eat it and are full, etc., etc. And here is a prediction. It's not, of course, in place. But honestly, anyone who would read it, you say, okay, so this is where it's an unusual prediction. It's not really an unusual prediction, because the song Ha'azinu is also, right, that sort of prediction, saying everyone's going to stray, and that's straight. That's Deuteronomy, right? That's Devarim. So if we go, so it's saying that they're going to sacrifice to idols, etc., etc., etc. Then I will hide my face from them. I will deliver them into the control of the nations for captivity, for booty, for being devoured. They'll forget all my law. After this, they will return to me from among the nations with all their minds, all their souls, and all their strength. Okay, so this is, you have the whole kind of the future of the Jewish people, the Israelite people, however you want to term it, and then we have an unusual passage here where we're mentioning of Belial. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why some people would say that Jubilees comes out of the Dead Sea set, because unusually here it's talking about may the spirit of Belial not rule them. It's not like the rest of the book, by the way. The rest of the book just talks about Mastema for the most part. And here it talks about the spirit of Belial ruling it. When we come back to Jubilees, I'm going to kind of go into depth about how it's using the spirit of Belial here. It's actually very interesting, because it's using it as a parallel to the foreign nations. May the spirit, the idea is the spirit of Belial shouldn't rule people to bring them to sin, and evil nations or foreign nations should not rule over the land of Israel, right? So this is kind of a perspective, a very Judean perspective, in terms of any foreign rule is by definition bad, and kind of you could say a Maccabean Hasmonean perspective that is not at all, would not find its place in the diaspora, at least the way we could see from Second Maccabees. Let me just move ahead here. And this is why I didn't go into the introduction before, because it's kind of wordy. But here we get to chapter 1, verse 27. Then he said to an angel of the presence, dictate to Moses, starting from the beginning of the creation until the time when my temple is built among them throughout the ages of eternity. This is supposed to be the book of Jubilees. Okay, so God says to the angel of the presence, to Malach HaPanim, it's a translation of Malach HaPanim, tell Moshe, this is what's going to happen. This is the whole history of the world from the creation. In other words, from the beginning of Breshit, the beginning of Genesis, up until the temple is built. Okay, and the angel of the presence, who was going along in front of the Israelite camp, took the tablets which told of the divisions of the years from the time the law, the divisions of the years, again, being weeks of 7 years, like Shemitah sets, and then Jubilee sets. Okay, so you have the history of the world told in Jubilees, in weeks, those are 7-year blocks, and in Jubilees, right, which is 7 times 7, right, the 49/50 year blocks.
Miriam, yes. Can you please say something about the term angel of presence? Like, it doesn't make sense to me, not in English and not in Hebrew. What is this thing, angel of presence?
I do think it's supposed to be the angels that are actually I believe it's supposed to be angels that are in the presence, that are in, actually, I think, I'm not, I would think that they're the angels that are either directly in the presence, or maybe it's connected to the idea that they're inner angels, right? But it's the same meaning. These are the highest level angels, right? They're the ones most directly in the presence of God. Okay.
So why they're called panim? Like, which face?
That's what I say. Panim. So that's why I'm saying, you would say Malacha Panim. I think that it's actually, and I have to look into this, I think it's actually an inner angel. I think it's an angel that's in the inner circle, but you could also read it as the angel that is facing God, as it were. But I think it's the inner angel.
It's sort of, it isn't like a reference to Moshe, Panim el Panim, his his relationship to God.
Right, but it's a weird thing to say about an angel. You could say it about an angel. That's why you could go either way, right? But I need to look into it more. I mean, it's a good question. Okay, and actually, let me write that down.
Marianne?
Yes.
Is there anything in the narrative here that refers in any way or any clear way to what we call the Torah? And if not, is it possible that it's actually meant to be understood as that Jubilees really is the Torah, replaces the Torah, forget about the Torah?
So wait a second. So this is a big question. Now, it does seem, if you read it, all right, he's already gotten the tablets, what we call the luchot, the regular traditional luchot. And now God tells this angel, the presence, to give him additional tablets. Okay. So it does seem that there's a recognition that there is something else besides Jubilees, and Jubilees is kind of the real story or something. Okay. Now, as I've mentioned before, and as I always give the Chatan Damim example, the bloody bridegroom example, where Jubilees, you can only understand Jubilees if you already know that story from the Torah, right? There is an assumption that you know the Torah, right? You know the Torah already, and now you're hearing Jubilees, right? Or reading Jubilees, however you're consuming the book of Jubilees. And it does, yes.
It's a sort of attitude of, well, we all know what you were told, but here's what really happened.
I do think so. Yes. In other words, and again, it solves problems that you have in the Torah. Now, could you just take the book of Jubilees and not read the Torah and have a complete story? In general, yes. Right. In general, like I like bringing the Chatan Damim, the bloody bridegroom example, because you really wouldn't have any idea what it's talking about if you didn't know the Torah. But in most cases, you get a complete narrative and a complete story just reading Jubilees, right? However, the reason it's saying certain things is because you know the Torah, and that created a problem. And now it's solving the problem. It's telling you, oh, no. It wasn't that God told the Israelites to borrow stuff from the Egyptians with the intention to not return them. It's the angels that told them that. And the reason the angels told them that was because the angels knew that these Egyptians owed them money for their labor. And this was going to make up for that. And in fact, the angels have to tie up Mastema so that he doesn't accuse the Israelites of stealing before God because of this thing they did with the instruction of the angels, right? That solves a moral problem. How could God tell the Israelites to lie to the Egyptians and borrow something they had no intention of returning? Right?
So is it maybe similar to Midrash Haggadah in many ways?
Yes, it's very similar. So that's the whole thing with Rewritten Bible in general. Rewritten Bible very much solves problems like Midrash does, but Midrash is much more careful with keeping I should say, most of the Midrashim, the not something like, let's say, I don't know, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. There are some Midrashim which retell a story, but most Midrashim bring the verse and then they bring, this is what happened, right? So, which sometimes contradicts the verse and sometimes doesn't, and sometimes it's an expansion. So it's very similar in terms of its goal and in terms of even how it works, except that it doesn't keep that distinction. Oh, that's the actual Torah verse. And this is all the Midrash. That's not what you have in a Rewritten Bible. In Rewritten Bible, it's giving you the whole story. It's like, this is the true story. It doesn't indicate, it doesn't necessarily quote. It sometimes does. It sometimes actually will quote the verse. But it doesn't make clear this now is a quoted verse and now the rest of it is lesser, right? It doesn't do that. Now, we are going to talk about the Pesher, and actually, I do want to kind of give us a contrast. I do kind of want to dive into the Pesher in our next class, and then we'll come back to the Rewritten Bible, because the Rewritten Bible is such a big corpus, and we've already done a big piece of it with Enoch. And I kind of want to almost take a break from it and do some of the Pesher so we can see that there are other things going on in this period. The Pesher is very much conscious, and I'm talking about it like it's a person thinking, but the authors of Pesharim in general were very conscious of, this is the verse and this is my interpretation. Yes.
Is there a general feeling regarding Jubilees and specifically that like the Midrashim and like the Torah Shebel Peh, that this is a form of oral tradition that was going around that is now being put into writing?
Oh, so with the Pesher, you're talking about the Pesher, or you're talking about the Rewritten Bible?
Right now, I'm talking about Jubilees, but I guess
Right. So with Jubilees, the question is, what's interesting is that it's giving itself as being written from the beginning. We're now in a written culture, right? The culture in the Second Temple period is very much a written culture. I shouldn't say that. Other people argue with me and they're like, well, this has to be performed. Not everyone is reading. Okay. But as opposed to, let's say, the First Temple period, where there is an idea of this that's being written down is a speech that Yirmiyahu gave, right? He gave this speech and he had a scribe to write it down, or he gave the speech, we don't know how it got written. And there's this idea here, things are very much being described as being written from the get-go. Right. So you'll have, Enoch's like, I wrote a book, so here we have the angels giving Moshe written tablets, right? They gave him written tablets. And that is an important point where there seems to be, I would say that they're not saying that it was orally passed down. They're saying it was writtenly passed down, right? It was passed down by being written and copied. And you can say, well, where are the old copies? No one was asking things like that then. Where would you have an old copy from? It would be gone. So you just say, okay, this is the copy. That's been passed down, that's been copied over since then. That seems to be the implication, because the idea is that Moshe was given written tablets. Okay, so if we go quickly back to our text. Hold on just a moment. Okay. So here, the angel of the presence who was going along in front of the Israelite camp took the tablets, which totaled the divisions of the years from the time the law and the testimony were created, right? For the weeks of their jubilees, year by year, in their full number. Now here, there is also seems to be an implication that it says they took the tablets, which totaled the divisions of the years from the time the law and the testimony were created. But we just found out it's from the beginning of creation, right? And that's that idea that we also have in Midrash, and of course in Jewish tradition, that the Torah is born with exists either right before the creation or from, well, in general, the Midrash is that it's from before the creation, right? And that's the idea here, is that the creation does not predate the law and the testimony, right? The law and the testimony being a translation of hachukim v'ha'edut, right? It's talking about the law, the Torah, right? So this is given to Moshe, and at Sinai, and it's going to retell what's going to happen also in the time of the Messiah. Okay, so again, that's the frame of Jubilees. Okay, so if we, this example here, again, is you could say, well, this is actually an unusual example when he say, who spoke to you at Mount Sinai and what the prince of Mastema wanted to do to you while you were returning to Egypt on the way of the shady fir tree. Did he not wish with all his strength to kill you? And we know, because we know the biblical text, that it seems to be referring to when, God, as it were, tries to kill Moshe on his way back, right, to Egypt. And you're like, wait, what? What's going on? And then Zipporah gives his kid a circumcision, and she throws the foreskin down. The whole story is weird and kind of like a surreal nightmare. And it seems to express that the danger of crossing, what do they always say, liminal space? The danger of crossing into a different area, the danger of travel, the danger of going from one state to another state, and that's where bad things can happen. But here, it's fixing something. It's not, that wasn't God. That wasn't like Yud Kei Vav Kei. That wasn't him. That was Mastema. Okay, and we're supposed to just kind of forget the biblical verse and do this. Now, again, as we've mentioned, the Hebrew Bible does this itself. Classically, right, where in Shmuel, at the end, it is God that tempts David to count the people, whereas when it's retold in Divrei Yamim and Chronicles, it is Satan, it is the Satan, or you could just say at that point it's the adversary. It isn't us, it's an adversary tempts David to do it, right? It's not God at all. And so that's a classic thing that needs to be kind of fixed in a retelling of the story. So that's a classic thing that, again, that Rewritten Bible does. Now let's take a look at some other quick examples. Just to remind us, what I'm using this class for is for this transition, so to kind of remind us where we're at, okay? We looked a lot at the book of Enoch. It's very much kind of a pseudepigraphon where everything kind of centers around a biblical character. And we looked a bit at Jubilees, which is a rewritten Bible. And we also took a look at and we looked at the halachic. Oh, and by the way, of course, I'll remind you of this nice thing in Genesis Apocryphon where it is expanding. It's not solving a problem. It's simply expanding on these verses where the Egyptians see Sarai and she is beautiful. And so they tell, Vayiru ota Sarai Paro, Vayalu ota el Paro, Adukacha isha bet Paro. They saw, the officers of Egypt saw her, they praised her to the Pharaoh, and he took her, and she was taken. She was taken to the house of Paro, of the Pharaoh. And in the Genesis Apocryphon, which we have already looked at, we have so the question is, well, how did he praise her? What did they say? Well, this tells us what they said, right? In other words, it's not a problem. It says in the verse that they praised her. So how did they praise her, right? They praise her face, they praise her hair, they praise her eyes, they praise her breasts, they praise her arms, her hands, her palms, her feet, her thighs, right? And then they come back, of course, to over all women is her beauty supreme, her loveliness far above them all. Yet with all this comeliness, she possesses great wisdom, and all that she has is beautiful. Okay. Again, a boon to PhD students the world over. You are, and everyone who's ever read a dedication, a PhD thesis to a wife, from anyone who does Dead Sea Scrolls or Second Temple works in any way at all, is gonna see this quote. It's perfect. Right? This over all women is her beauty supreme, her loveliness far above them all. Yet with all her this comeliness, she possesses great wisdom, and all that she has is beautiful. And if we go back to, okay, so let's go back, okay, that's Rewritten Bible. Going on to another example of biblical interpretation in this period are our halachic commentaries, things where they're taking biblical verses and learning legal rules from them. Okay, so that's something that we're very familiar with. Here in the Damascus document, this is a sectarian document. In general, when we talk about laws of the Second Temple period, all we've got is Qumran. It's not that it didn't exist anywhere else. It's just what survived is from Qumran. So that's what we always keep going to. This does produce a kind of a bias when we talk about these laws, because we only have this one unusual group to look at when we talk about laws in this period in terms of texts that we can point to. Okay, so here is talking about how Belial misleads people outside of the sect to believe the wrong laws, believe that the wrong law is the correct law. What is one of these examples? One of these examples is taking two wives in their lifetimes. Although the principle of creation is male and female, he created them. Zachar v'nekeva barautam, right? And that's a quote. And the animals went into the ark 2 by 2. So clearly you are only supposed to have one spouse, whether male or female. You're not supposed to have two wives. They are learning this out from verses in Genesis, which would be very unusual for, let's say, Pharisee halacha to learn something from that. But to the Qumran community, this is very, very clear. Now let's go into what we're going to go now to kind of take a break from Rewritten Bible. We're going to go into the Pesher. So the Pesher is unusual in that, first of all, and again, here we have a little bit of a bias because of what has survived. Qumran, Qumran, it's only found at Qumran. Whenever you talk about the Pesher, this is what it's called, based on Qumran text, and we've only found it at Qumran. It's a lot like what we're used to in exegesis in medieval commentaries and later, where you have the verse quoted and then the commentary. The difference is that in the Pesher, the verses are interpreted to be saying something either about us right now, or about our recent history, or possibly about the Messianic age, right? So this is unusual in terms of written Jewish commentary. It is not unusual if you think about, let's say, rabbinic sermons, right? The Dvar Torah in Shul, where you will frequently have a rabbi talk about a biblical text and then say, and this explains what we're going through today, right? So that is, it's more like that, but it does look at the specifics of the verse. So here, this is always a good quote to start with. So this is Pesher Chavakuk. So it's a Pesher written about the book of Chavakuk. I had a student, I gave a class of Dead Sea Scrolls in a certain college, and where all of the students had a background in Jewish texts, had a background in Jewish schools, and I taught them about Pesher Chavakuk, and one of the students was very good about taking advantage of office hours, and she came to office hours and she said, "So Chavakuk was a member of the sect." I said, "No, he was a Navi. He was a prophet." She says, "No." I said, "No, he really was." She's like, "No." I said, "No, I'll show you." And I start opening a Tanakh. I start opening a Hebrew Bible, and I flip to it and I show her. And as I'm flipping, she says, "I am so not believing you right now." So I am making a note here. Chavakuk was a prophet. He's not a member of the sect. We have Pesher Chavakuk. We have Pesher Nahum also similarly. We'll look at some of the different Pesharim soon, because that's what we're going to do now. But here, as if we look at this example here, Vayedaber el Chavakuk lichtov et habaot al hador ha'acharon v'et gemar haketz lo hoda'o. Okay, so and God spoke to Chavakuk to write these things that were going to happen, but and this is translation is good, but when that period would be complete, he did not make known to him. Vasher Amar, and here's a quote, Vasher Amar, Liman Yarutz HaKorebo, right? So that someone can read it with ease. Pishro, its interpretation. This is why we have the word Pesher, because it always starts Pishro, its interpretation. Al Moreh HaTzedek, Asher Hodio El Et Kol Razei Divrei Avadav HaNevi'im. Right? Its meaning is, what's really talking about is about the teacher of righteousness, right? That God let him know all the secrets of the words of his prophets, of his servants, the prophets. Ki od chazon lamoed yafiach laketz v'lo yichazev. Another quote, because a prophecy will testify for a specific period and will not deceive regarding the end time. So this comes closer to this idea that there was some kind of oral tradition, oral revelation that was revealed only to the teacher of righteousness, and which the prophets didn't know. That this interpretation was not written, it was revealed later on so that you would know what the true meaning is. Okay, now this idea, of course, in Jewish tradition is fairly prominent, where you absolutely have this idea that, the prophets weren't just speaking to their generation, they were speaking to all future generations, right? That's the classic answer to Second Isaiah. You're like, well, why? How is he talking about Koresh? It's like, well, he was just saying something that would only be understood by future generations, right? So that is a classic way of looking at prophecy, but this idea that it was specifically revealed to a specific person is unusual. gonna pause for questions. I haven't seen any questions from you guys.
The Sharim were strictly sectarian.
Yes, the Pesher is sectarian. And
Wasn't
thank you for pointing that out. Yes.
wasn't there a Pesher found on Masada?
I don't know of one. There were some sectarian. I know that there were some texts that seemed to be copies of sectarian materials that were found on Masada, right? I think maybe a piece of the Damascus document, right? There were things that were found in Masada that seemed to have belonged to the sect. I do not remember if there was a Pesher as one of them. Okay, so let us continue. Okay, so when the verse says so that you should write it down so that someone can read it, kind of runningly read it, they can read it with ease, what it's actually talking about is write it down so that the teacher of righteousness will understand what it's talking about. Okay. And that's what it means when it says that the prophecy is speaking for a specific time period. It will not disappoint regarding the end time. In other words, it's talking about us. It's talking about our time period. It wasn't just talking to the initial listeners at all. Okay. Now, would they say it didn't have any meaning to the initial listeners? Probably not. But the real meaning is in our generation. Okay. And now it's going in to the interpretation of further interpretation of that verse. Okay, so now it's actually explaining what does that mean that this it's testifying about a certain period. This means that the last days will be long, much longer than the prophets had said. For God's revelations, kirazeh el lehafla'ah, because the mysteries of God are really mysterious, are wondrous. Right? If he tarries, be patient for him, or if it tarries, be patient. Because it surely will come and it will not be late. What does that verse mean? Pishro al anshe ha'emet oseh ha'torah, asher lo yirpu yedehem me'avodat ha'emet. It's talking about the people of truth who do the Torah, that their hands will not weaken from the work of truth. When that final period becomes long. Because for all the times, it says here fixed by God. It was just like all the time periods. Yeah, you could say fixed by God, even though it doesn't say the verb, will come in their due course as he ordained that they should by Birazeh Ormato, in the secrets of his planning, of his wisdom. So what this is, and this is what we're going to be talking about more in depth, is looking at these verses, all right, as as something that speaks about our group. And if that's what you said, oh, are these sectarian? Yes, these are absolutely sectarian. When you look at pretty much any Pesher, it has the beliefs of the Qumran sect and the identity of the Qumran sect kind of written all over it. Okay, so when you and that's a big part of and it's a big part of them saying, okay, of the way it seems to be a big part of the way they're reading the prophets, right? Where they're reading these prophets as, what are they saying about our group? Why? Because a big part of Qumran beliefs was, we are living in the end time. We are living in the end time. We are that group of righteous people who are going to survive into the Messianic age by doing the right thing, right? And this is going to happen now. And by the way, this is one of the reasons. Like, I mean, I don't talk a lot about because where I studied and how I studied in my background, I don't think a lot of the Qumran community as a parallel to what they call the early Jesus movement, right? Which is the beginnings of Christianity before the church, right? So they call that the early Jesus movement because it wasn't the church yet. It wasn't really Christianity yet. The guys who were kind of going around with Jesus, right? So those guys, and later Christian interpretation after his death, in terms of reading the Torah and the prophets as talking about him, as talking about what happened to Jesus in his life, right, is a little similar to that. And certainly in terms of the way afterwards they read Jesus even into early biblical stories, right, where, the sacrifice of Isaac, like reading that into early stories, that the whole idea of prefiguration, that sort of idea, you can kind of see certain parallels, not exact parallels, because you don't see the Qumran community doing this with narratives. They're not saying this story is actually talking about the teacher of righteousness, because that would not make any sense, right? But they will say the prophets were talking about the teacher of righteousness. The prophets were talking about our community. The prophets were talking about what happened to us 2 years ago. That was in the prophecy. That's what this verse means. And so again, while we don't have this sort of interpretation in a written form, in a standard commentary form, we do very much do this sort of thing when we're giving a talk, right? We'll say, because the idea is, and again, this is part of the whole driving need for biblical interpretation, which is whenever you have, and I've said this before, whenever you have a canon, which is a canon, generally means that on the one hand it's very important, and on the other hand you can't change it. So those things it's got to be relevant because it's very important, but you can't change it. So how is it relevant? So the answer is you interpret it to explain how it's relevant. And this is part of that driving force. A driving force behind much of Second Temple literature is this type is all these different types of interpretation. The need to find continual relevance in these holy works, right? And so we have layers and layers of interpretation and books of interpretation, different types of interpretation. And because these books are so important, these works are so important, and they are so relevant, but how are they relevant? And you can't change them, right? And we'll see that the Pesher is in its form is particularly interesting because we'll actually see where they avoid places where they seem to change the text, places where they avoid changing the text, because they're quoting it. They're quoting the text. But with God's name, they will, and there are certain cases where they'll kind of downgrade God's name. Like you'll have the tetragrammaton in the original verse, and they'll downgrade it to a lesser God's name because they don't want to write the tetragrammaton. Possibly they don't want to write it outside of the original book, scroll, you should say, right? They don't want to write it outside of the original kind of passage. So when they quote the verse, they want to kind of downgrade it and not use a tetragrammaton. So that it's all, you see all sorts of interesting ideas. And also we learn a lot about the history of the sect and things that happened to the sect and how they saw their place in the world. And more exactly in the nation of, in the Jewish kind of milieu, we learn a lot of that from the Pesher, because they're interpreting all of this stuff as talking about them. So they'll be like, yeah, that was 2 years ago when they tried to make us eat on Yom Kippur, so you learn all these things about them because they're interpreting this to talk about things that have happened to them.
Miriam?
Okay, yes, questions.
This idea that Habakkuk received the prophecy, but he didn't really understand it, and nobody understood it until the Moreh Tzedek. Would it be accurate to say that that's a convoluted way of attributing prophecy to the Moreh Tzedek without attributing prophecy to him? They would like to attribute prophecy to him, but they can't. So they're saying this was his prophecy. It came from a long time ago, but he's really the only one who ever understood it.
Well, in a certain, at least in a way, right? Because it's certainly, in terms of the way it's describing the Moreh HaTzedek, right? It seems to be describing him in a way like he's a prophet, right? Because if he's getting the revelation of what this actually means, he certainly sounds like a prophet, right? In terms of the actual content, sometimes it's a little bit more like prophecy, and sometimes it's more like this is what happened to us already, right? But yes, and I think that, and that's been argued. I think like Alex Jason, as you probably know, has written about the different types of things the Qumran community was involved in and how they can be similar to prophecy, but of course they never call it prophecy. They will never call it prophecy, and when they use the term prophecy, they always use it in the context of false prophecy. Because, and again, I would say it's because everyone knows that prophecy is no longer valid. In other words, you can't say that you are a current prophet because that means you are a false prophet because there is no more prophecy. So you have to kind of work around it. So I do think, Moshe, that it's a way of describing the Moreh HaTzedek in a way that's essentially he's a prophet, right? You know, because there's continuous revelation. You have, as soon as you describe him this way, you have a channel for continuous revelation. Because here he is, and there is this idea, and again, and this isn't the only place where they talk about the Moreh HaTzedek as kind of a source of a continuous revelation, or there being this kind of revelation of what the correct law is, and there are different accounts of the correct law, because so if we look at what the passage that we quoted, that we looked at earlier in the Damascus document, that looks at the source for law as opposed to something that you could actually get to on your own. In other words, hey, look, the verse says 2 by 2. Can't you see that we're right? In other places, you have the idea of legal things that we know, but no one else knows. They just don't know the right thing here because we had some kind of revelatory source for what the true law is. Any other questions before we finish? Okay, so next week we're going to be diving into the Pesherim. So that's what we're going to do to kind of give us a taste of something a little bit different. So we're going to be looking at some Pesherim. Those Pesherim, again, we're going to be looking at kind of the interpretation, but also what they tell us about the sect. So that's in general. It doesn't make sense to look at just the interpretive aspect of the Pesherim without looking at what it tells us about the people who wrote them, because a lot of what we know about the sect and their history and their attitudes and the situation they lived in, we can learn from the Pesherim. So thank you everyone for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next week.